Ståle, perhaps you can tell me a little bit about your background, both personally and intellectually and politically, where you came from, and how you became interested in political and economic theory.
Yeah, so I come from. I grew up in a small village called Aksdal outside a small city called Haugesund, between the fjords and the mountains in Norway. And I'm not sure how actually I got into socialism, or I joined the Socialist Youth when I was about 16. I'm not really sure why. Partly maybe some kind of moral compass, feeling bad for poor people, combined with seeing Kristina Halvorsen on television. She was the leader of the Socialist Left Party at the time. So I joined the Socialist Youth, and that felt right. And when young in Norway in the 90s, it was like either you're a Maoist or you're not a Maoist. I understood pretty early on I was not a Maoist, so I felt home at the Socialist Youth and read a critique of Trotsky's critique of Stalin, read some Rosa Luxemburg and a little bit Marx. It was mainly activism and not much that reading and not that much theory that young. So I don't know why actually I became a socialist, something like that. And nobody in my family are socialist, apart from my father. He was socialist, but he died a long time ago. So he died when my mother was pregnant with me. But I didn't know that he was a socialist after I had become a socialist. So yeah, I imagine it's a coincidence. Tempting to think it's not. I don't know. So I joined the Socialist Youth, and then I moved to Bergen to study. And then a handful of us socialists met a handful of environmentalists, and together we joined forces and created a housing movement. And we started squatting houses, and we're doing all kind of housing activism. And that's how I found human geography. Trying to link things together here. So I started studying human geography. A bunch of us started studying human geography because we were housing activists. And then finding human geography, easy to find like David Harvey and Neil Smith and Henri Lefebvre and all that. That was perfect. And intellectually, I was moving a little bit more towards, I never called myself an anarchist, but more like autonomist circles and anarcho-syndicalist influences in those years as a housing activist and squatter. Until I was working very much with housing activism until I was finished my master's and got a job as an urban planner in Bergen. And then suddenly I was working for the municipality. It was a little bit hard to run around squat houses. So I took a break or stopped doing that. And moved for some reason to Sweden to do a PhD in 2010. And then I decided I've grown up. It's time to come home to a political party. So I joined the Left Party in Sweden, which is this traditional old reformed communist party. Where I'm still a member 14 years later, and I joined the Left Party, and I also come into contact with the Swedish section of the Fourth International, the Socialist at the time called Socialist Party. And I was quite close to them, just socially and intellectually for a few years, but it was impossible to join because Left Party didn't allow for double membership in two parties. 2019, the Socialist Party, changed name to Socialist Politics, ending their decade-year-long aim of becoming a proper party and saying we're just some kind of activist think tank. Then a lot of people went from the Socialist Politics now, then joined the Left Party, but also a few of us from Left Party joined Socialist Politics. So politically, I'm double. I'm a member of both this old Euro-communist Left Party, now reformist into a more reform-oriented party, and the Swedish section of the Fourth International. And I feel that it's also, maybe you can see it in the book, one foot in Trotskyism and one foot in Euro-communism, standing that split somehow. I feel makes, at least in Sweden, makes sense politically. But I also feel that you can see it maybe in the book, there's obviously a lot of Ernst Mandel in there, but also Perlanzas, for example. So they're kind of where I am. In terms of how I found the theories, I wasn't really, of course, as part of a leftist milieu, we were kind of reading quite a lot, but never reading seriously before I started my master's in 2005 to 7. And then I didn't read seriously again before I started my PhD in 2010. And that was when I started reading kind of seriously. And then my PhD was about economic crisis in relation to urban theory or urban planning. And then this crisis has obviously escalated ever since, and now escalating with this book. That's my final work on crisis after 14 years.
Maybe we could backtrack a bit, and if you're willing, talk a bit about your father, because I think he plays an important role in a new project you're working on. So,
yeah. So my father worked on an oil platform. My father and my mother had one child already. Then my brother, he was 1 year old, and they just built a new house. And my father was working on rigs, but he quitted because he wanted to stay home when the second child came, which is me. So actually he stopped going offshore. He was just going to work onshore. And now he's just going to work on land. And somebody calls in ill, and he get a phone. Can you just join this last trip, just to go? And of course, there was still 3 months till I was going to be born, so there was enough time to get out and get home, and there was a lot of money going there. And he went on a platform was called Alexander Kielland. And the platform, there's a catastrophe, quite central in Norwegian oil history, and it capsizes. And my father then, 26-year-old electrician, dies together with 122 colleagues.
And that's the biggest industrial accident on an oil rig in Norway, is it?
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And what is the position of oil workers in the kind of Norwegian society? Are they a aristocracy of labor, or are they a central element in the labor movement?
It depends. It's quite complicated. In terms of being an aristocracy, in the sense that you earn a little bit more than others, it matters very much if employed by Equinor or not, for example.
If you're employed by
Equinor.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're employed by Equinor, you have fairly good conditions. If you work for some supply company doing some supply things on a boat, for example, you work on significantly different conditions. So it depends.
Very high levels of unionization.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And have oil workers been involved in radical social movements, or not so much?
So this is good questions, and this is stuff I'm going to start working on now for my next project. And I'll start interviewing. I've started doing some interviews, and we'll do more. And historically, it's been yes, there's been a lot of class struggle on the rigs, legal and illegal. To the degree that they managed to get a fairly good position in Norway, which has been threatened. As soon as there's a question of profitability, it's threatened. But as soon as the profitability is back, security and the rights are kind of secured.
And you mentioned Maoism, and that's something that's always intrigued me. Why would a country like Norway, that is so different from most of the countries where Maoism had a significant influence, which are often countries in the global south, why did Maoism specifically have some strength in Norway?
That is also a good question. Start with saying that I'm not 100% sure, and I'm not sure if anybody can be 100% sure, because it can be, we talk about relatively small groups, so it can be stuff like just individuals. It can be a handful of people at universities being Maoist rather than, say, Trotskyist, and that influencing generations. But if you want to look for structural reasons, it's tempting to take or to say something first about nationalism. So Norway was under Denmark for 400 years, and under Sweden for 100 years, and then it was the occupation from the Nazis, and then there was a struggle against joining was now EU. So, and that's all progressive struggles. So the history of nationalism in Norway is easy to read in a progressive light. And of course, with Maoism, you get a good deal of like this independent nation states and nationalism. The other is also that, so that's one thing. The other, I think, maybe more important than the second one, but the role of farmers is also quite interesting. But the farmers in Norway are quite progressive. They are small scale compared to like Sweden. They're much smaller and much more left wing. And if you have a extreme fetish for farmers like Maoists do, that's maybe easy also to.
And did the Maoists have any base in rural areas, or was it?
No, no, mainly universities.
Right. And maybe you could say something about the nature of Norwegian social democracy and its not only its political but also its intellectual trajectory.
Norwegian social democracy, like historically.
Yeah.
Yeah, so historically, it's of course the working class movement coming out of hard class struggle through the 19th and early 20th century, becoming reformist through all kind of crazy things in the 10s and 20s, going a little bit in and out. So social democracy always in and out of the Third International before it finally went out and became a more hard or like 100% reformist project. It was to have a strong working class base, which was fascinating and great, and of course a strength. But the Norway never had so Norway didn't have it was never like aristocracy in the feudal period because we were under Denmark, so Denmark didn't want to have any half kings in Norway. So the structure of the upper class is a little bit different from, for example, in Sweden. Or structure of the ruling class or the coming bourgeoisie becomes a little bit different when you don't really have somebody to like take over to transform into the bourgeoisie. So you have what you call embedsmen, which is more like state aristocracy, state managers aristocracies, and they also a lot of them tend to be social democrats as well. So as the social democracy develop into a more nation building project and more getting the hegemony over Norway, what you find is that you always have a leader with a working class background, and then all the ministers being from nicer backgrounds, so to speak, until Gro Harlem Brundtland came in the 80s, herself coming from a nice background. So when she came into power, it was problematic for a lot of people in social democracy. She was a woman, interesting in environment, and also coming from a very nice family. Three things that was not easy to swallow for some of the old men. Yeah.
And did Norwegian social democracy have as in Sweden left currents like Meidner and others who were claimed to be Marxists and so on, or was it very much a very centrist or conformist kind of party?
No, they did have their left tendencies. So, for example, when Gro came to power, there's a power struggle between Gro and Reiulf Steen. He was the left wing of the two.
What period is this?
It's be late 70s, or in 70s. So, that would be a pure left-right struggle. He was too radical to become a prime minister. So they got someone else to be prime minister, even though he was the leader. And when he was going to be the prime minister then, because no one resigned, they needed someone else. And he was just too radical. So there's been stuff like that. And if you want to talk about differences between Norway and Sweden in terms of social democracy, it's also interesting to see the role of the labor union. For some reason, it's a little bit hard to know exactly why. The Norwegian labor union has been striking much more than the Swedish one. The Swedish one has hardly been striking. The Norwegian one is still, like now, every year there are a few strikes here and there. Exactly why, hard to say. Maybe because, of course, it was split in Sweden with the anarcho-syndicalist union, which maybe took some of the radical people. Maybe because social democracy was more like it was stronger hegemony over the different social movements that they controlled. It was maybe a little bit looser in Norway, so more space for more radical people. Also in LO, the big labor union. But also another thing is that, I'm not sure how important it is, but it's a factor that's interesting, that socialism came to Sweden from Germany. And you got German social democracy basically coming to Sweden, and that's already, it's already reformist when it's crossing the borders. To Norway, you have socialism coming from a little bit from Germany and Sweden, but also get a lot of coming from USA. Working class people going to USA, organized in IWW, coming home to Norway, going into the social democracy, and then you have in 1910 you have a big struggle within this social democracy in Norway with which line to follow, how radical to be. Everything becomes reformist by time, but some of the same people adapt and bring with them some of this fighting spirit, maybe. Yeah, there's interesting follow some of the people there, like Martin Tranmæl becoming one of these persons. So exactly how broad it is, of course, hard to say, but it is interesting to see this U.S. influence coming with this, fighting spirit.
So you just published this book, Against the Crisis, Economy and Ecology in a Burning World. How, maybe you could say something about how you came to write it. What was the driving questions that led you to start working on this book?
So the driving question. So just like what actually happened was that I have been working on ecological economic crisis for a lot of years in relation to urban things, urban planning, urban development. And at the fall of 2019, I just got an idea, going to write a short little book where I take out everything about urban and just going to be a short little book, handbook on economic and ecological crisis. This was 2019, and then I did also receive a lot of research money, so I did have a lot of time to do what I wanted, and I wanted to do what I wanted to do first, but before I did what I wanted to, before I did what I needed to do. Sorry. And then a few weeks later come 2020. So suddenly I sit there alone by myself for a year and just digging into this, and it becomes much longer and deeper than planned. And I start working with the topics, some of the topics. Some of this already there. Some of this came through that 2020, 2021 when I wrote it. So that's kind of where it came from. In terms of the main, where it intellectually came from, or the main like driving question come from, politically maybe more than intellectually, it come from historical materialism conferences. In the early 2010s, I was here a lot to listen to people speaking about the economic crisis. And the conclusion to economic crisis at this conference, as always in academia, is revolution. We need to change the system to fix these problems with the crisis. And that's, of course, I subscribe 100% to that. But when a lot of us then went home to our home parties, especially myself, going home to Sweden, to my left party, and seeing what then my own party did as an actual crisis policy, is 100% Keynesianism. It's going to invest our way out of crisis, and end of story. And when it comes to the ecological crisis, same thing. You go to academic conferences, the conclusion is always to try to reform or try to like change the complete system, completely change the system. And then you come to the politicians, which we are kind of part of the same movement, and it's only about Green New Deal and investment and investing you out of the problems. And that kind of dilemma has been with me through the years, and that's where I've kind of struggled. And I want to contribute, if anything, hopefully the book can contribute a little bit to start think also politically what kind of crisis policy means that's not strictly Keynesian. How do we define crisis? How do we understand such a concept? In itself, of course, extremely difficult and broad and can mean different things, especially now. Everybody uses it for everything. So how do we delimit it? How do we make sense of it? How do we use it and how do we not use it? And there's two mistakes we can do, I think, when trying to figure out what a crisis means. One is to go and to the dictionary. The crisis means this. You find a word or a synonym that this is the real meaning of crisis. Or you go back to old Greek or like Latin, or this is the origin of the word, and you pretend you found the real meaning. But that misses, of course, how language develops and how the world develops. So both the concept we will describe and the words we use change over time, so we need to adapt for that. The other big mistake is to go to the other extreme and say, okay, everything goes. If you call that a crisis, who am I to say to you that that's not a crisis, that's a bottle. So that's, in that sense, we cannot communicate because we don't know what each other means. So we need a combination of going back to history, seeing the history of the concept, understanding today where they come from and how to understand them. And from trying to work with this, I inspired by Bob Jessop, but especially Ben Said. So Bob Jessop says crisis as some sort of symptomatology, They are symptoms of underlying stuff, underlying relations, underlying processes. Ben Said calls it a paroxysm, that they are the sudden paroxysm being the sudden outbreak of a known disease. So what both Jessup and Ben Said are hinting at here, that something happening at two levels of abstraction. There's something happening, and which is related to something underlying. And I think this is a very important start. And what I do with basically in the book is to take this seriously and say, okay, I accept this. We start from here, we work from here. And that means that some things are crises and some things are not crises. So I start from there and I say, crises then are some kind of turning points, taking that from the history of the crisis, some kind of turning points necessarily consisting of three components. It's an event that's becoming fairly rapid, rooted in underlying processes or structures that necessarily then have negative consequences for humans in some way, just to exclude the fact that it might be a good thing from the definition. Without the first, if we don't have events, we can have all kind of permanent situations. If we don't have a second, we can have all kind of things happen by chance. And if we don't have third, we can have, thing that might be good for everyone. So, and this means that working with this definition, and this is how I view crisis, the whole book is written in light of this. It means that some things are crises, some things are not crises. So when the geographer Jerry Diamond, for example, say that crisis can come out of nowhere, he's wrong. Then those phenomena he points at are not crises, in my view. When the Danish anthropologist Henrik Wiig says that crisis is no longer in the context, crisis is the context, the situation now is a permanent crisis, he's wrong. That's not pointing to crisis, he's pointing at to certain fairly permanent phenomena in capitalism. So in this sense, I have a distinct definition that kind of, that follows through the book. And you can disagree with it, but I think it makes the book easier to read because you know what I mean by crisis when I discuss all these things about crisis and how, when I say, for example, capitalism reproduces itself through crisis, if crisis means everything, like it often does, that argument becomes quite meaningless, right? But with a distinct meaning of crisis and understanding of crisis, that kind of become more concrete. Yeah. So in that sense, crisis become a quite complex phenomena because it's necessarily working on different levels of abstraction. This is two, the event and underlying, but we can divide them in more. And it forces us to necessarily look at the concrete and the abstract, the particular and the general. It forces us to look at humans and structures, etc. So I think a proper understanding of crisis cannot be written only from an abstract philosophical perspective or only from an empirical historical perspective. The subject doesn't allow those kind of investigations. You need to invite, to mix or to manage to look at both the historical empirical and the theoretical abstract structural. And that's very difficult. And all I can say is that I did my best to mix them or to combine them and to work with both sides. But that was a struggle to work with crisis, but also, of course, very, very interesting.
Great. And you say that the two important influences in the book are Ernest Mandel and Nikos Poulantzas. Maybe you could say something about, in each case, what it is that you find most important in almost inspirational in writing the book.
From those two in particular?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, we can start with Mandel then. I think what I get from Mandel, and this is, I think is very important from the book, is trying to see that several tendencies are existing at the same time and must be accounted for. And not trying to limit yourself to one tendency.
Monocausality.
So in economic crisis, this is huge debate in Marxism, and I follow Mandel's line there. There's no reason to choose between, for example, overproduction and following rate of profit, which has become this great civil war in Marxist theory. And I try to zoom out, basically. They're saying this discussion, of course, is two different ways of seeing the problem, of seeing the economy, seeing the crisis. And one of them, you can see it from a realization perspective of production, and one from production perspective, the organic composition of capital. And that's two different ways of seeing the crisis. And then we can zoom further out, and I also makes different level of abstraction to show where this conflict exists in a broader view of the crisis. So that's one thing from Mandel. And also the afterword is called Optimism at the edge of the cliff. It's also homage to his never-ending optimism, which I like. And from Poulantzas, there's some Poulantzas in there also on fascism. There's some Poulantzas on there on class fractions. But if you want me to mention one thing, it's been I think the concept of the relative autonomy of the state is absolutely crucial to understand how crises are reproduced, or how crises reproduce capitalism. So there's some main arguments in the book. I think there's two main arguments. The one argument is that capitalism produces crisis. The other one is that crisis reproduces capitalism. And if you now focus on the second one, and the world looks very different if you see it from either of those perspectives. If you see the world from how capitalism produces crisis, capitalism look fragile, it look weak, it looks like it's going to collapse any time because you focus on these things driving it through crisis. It looks like problems. If you look at from the other side, how capitalism produces itself through crisis, how crisis reproduces capitalism, and how capitalism thereby also solves crisis, the system looks extremely flexible, extremely rigid, and you can see that it can exist on any kind of all kind of sorts. It can exist on or it can solve the crisis through more welfare state or through genocide, through human rights or through wars, through social democracy or monarchies, or through conservatism or liberalism. From this perspective, you see the flexibility, and on that side of looking at it, how capitalism reproduces itself through crisis, I think Poulantzas' concept of the relative autonomy of the state is very important. For example, Elmar Altvater wrote a book in 1991 about the crisis, and he could not miss mentioning that half of the world had just gone under due to a massive political crisis. And his explanation for why, he has some interesting remarks there on the crisis in Soviet Union versus in the West. The one is exactly about this. So his argument then is that in the Soviet Union there was no relative autonomy between the political sphere and the economic sphere. So when there was a problem in the economy, people looked to the politicians. What have you done? Fix it. Because the economy was supposed to be democratic. It was there to fix. This doesn't happen in the economy, in Western economies or in capitalism. As you have this relative autonomy between the spheres, an economic crisis might become a political crisis if the political conditions are like in this way, but doesn't have to. And I think that's very important. And so when economic crisis, for example, hit, the politicians can first say, it's not our fault, partly true. And then they can also step in and say, but we're going to fix it. So we rally the nation, come together, here we are to fix the problems. So politicians get out of crisis, can get out of crisis. Some might do wrong policy and lose from it, or might win a lot from it. And this is only due to relative autonomy. So if there was no autonomy between the economic and policy, all economic crisis, for example, would immediately become political crisis. If there were full autonomy, you can imagine politicians just saying, okay, economy you can burn, we can rule over whatever comes next. Doesn't happen. The politicians will always save the capitalist economy because they're dependent on it. In order to reproduce itself as a capitalist state.
And presumably that you also relate that to what someone like Ellen Meiksens-Wundt talks about, the constitutive separation of the political and the economic under capitalism, which obviously is a very important insight, but some have criticized this notion of the separation of politics and economics under capitalism as only capturing certain phases of capitalism and underestimating the role of force and violence in both in the origins and later on, the role of imperialism, colonialism, and so on. Is that something that you agree with, or you have some nuances with?
Yeah, no, I don't have too much to say. I 100% get that argument, and I to large degree agree. It's not like that separation is there always. It's not like that separation is full, it's relative. I think the main problem with the concept of relative autonomy is that it's vague. Vague, thank you. But that's also needed to describe that phenomena, or that thing, that relation between economy and political. I think we need a vague concept because it's so flexible. It can differ very much over time. So in that sense, I feel, it works as a starting point. But if you're going to do any empirical analysis, of course, you need to, get more into it.
And I take it you were not convinced then by Mandel's polemic against Eurocommunism, where he criticizes a number of Eurocommunists.
Yeah, so I guess me standing is split with 1 foot in the Fourth International and 1 foot in the Eurocommunism, I think Mandel would turn his grave. Absolutely, no doubt. But then again, and I do agree with his critique of Eurocommunism. I think he has some critique that this is just taking the words from social democracy and Stalinism and combining them. Maybe rude to say, but I agree with some of this critique. But I think some of the problems we face politically, theoretically, is sometimes not necessarily solved through discussion, but through time. At that time, when Soviet Union was still there, social democracy was there in a very different way. That kind of discussion has a very different place than now. So I think Trotskyism is not a concept that flies anymore. Trotskyism, Eurocommunism hardly exists in a broader world anyhow. But I think these kind of milieus need to work together today partly because we're so weak, and partly to establish some kind of common sense leftism that is not campist and Stalinist. And that's where these kind of milieus should merge, in my view.
So you publish this book in a context where there's an inflation of discourse about crisis that has been particularly popularized by Adam Tooze and his concept of polycrisis. What do you make of that the discussion around the notion of polycrisis?
Polycrisis. So, so polycrisis became popular in 2020, 2021. Wasn't it also the word of the year or something in Financial Times 2022 or something? And I think it's very interesting that the concept of crisis became so popular, not only Adam Tooze, but among power holders in the early 2020s. Because this was basically the same power holders that for a decade tried to avoid any kind of crisis. So after 2008 was met by all kind of policies trying not to change anything, basically. Remain the same political economy by, lowering interest rates, throwing money into the economy just to keep the shit going. But this was a real crisis, and no politician in the world can stop a real crisis when it's rolling out, and it did. And it then again came back in 2020, and there was obviously no way you can save that pre-2008 economy after 2020. And I think even the ruling class, so to speak, or leading politicians and leading experts understood this in 2020. But I think the main problem why they cannot find something else, I think so much changed during 2010s, politically, economically, ideologically, not least. But what did not change in 2010s was class power. So the class relations were pretty much the same as before 2008. And to put it a little bit blunt, I think what we have been looking at the last 4 years, when polycrisis has become very popular among the elites, is a ruling class and ruling politicians looking for something else than neoliberalism, but not finding it. Because one premises for the new system they want to find is that the class, privileges is just as good as in neoliberalism. And finding a new way of organizing an economy where you can have it as privileged for a ruling class as it was before 2008 is hard to find, because they were very much privileged. I think this is where we are now. A ruling class is searching for new ways of organizing the economy, but cannot find it. And that's why also they start thinking about crisis. And I, to be honest, I don't think it's a good sign that they speak about crisis, because what the rulers do with crisis, well, as Naomi Klein showed in the shock doctrine, they use them. So yeah, that's my view of the polycrisis.
So maybe we can address the first argument about the crisis tendencies in capitalism. As you say, there are many different and warring accounts of the cause of crisis in Marxist theory. Very early on, there was a notion of disproportionality between the various sectors. Then there was the notion of the falling rate of profit, sometimes linked, sometimes not, to what's called breakdown theory, the notion that capitalism was going to inevitably collapse or break down. And then there are other alternatives, such as the cause of capitalist crisis is due to the power of labor, periods of intense class struggle that hit profit rates and change somewhat the balance of class forces in the workplaces. And then there is the notion of overproduction or overaccumulation. And then there are other versions. So maybe you could say a little bit about these different theories and how you think it is possible to make them compatible and rather than alternative to each other.
Yeah, so if we start by Marx, then the defenders of each of these theories can find their quote in Marx's work. You know, Marx says here, this is the most important tendency, and there, that is the most important tendency. And also me supporting Mandel's take here then is that several tendencies coexist. You can also find that in the theories of surplus value. What he called world market theories is when all the contradiction of bourgeois production collapse simultaneously or together or something. But yeah, as you said, in the one interesting thing with this development of this theory is that so for Marx it was obviously, I guess he worked on different things at different times, but it was not that hard to live with several theories. I guess it's fairly much at the same time. But when he dies, there's different kind of schools take over. And what's interesting for this history is that what people think is the Marx theory reflect their own situation when they live. So in between the world wars, it was overproduction, underconsumption being the main theory. In a period when it looks like the poverty of the working class was going to increase forever till, it was hard to see where it's going. Also a time with much collapse theory and with Kautsky that this crisis will lead to crisis momentum mori, like the foresight of that, or the beginning of the end of capitalism is around the corner. It's very much in the spirit of the time, and even liberals think at this time capitalism is going under. So the crisis theory is very much affected by that, and then people think Marx wrote this, which kind of reflects their time, so to speak. So we move in the post-war decades. We get in when the crisis finally reappeared then in 1973. You get, as you said, profit squeeze, for example, which is a very different theory. Now suddenly the label that wages were too high was a problem. At the same time, you also get theories like operaismo, like there is the strong working class is driving capitalism, and capitalists just reacting to that. And you can find quotes from Marx to support that. And that, of course, was a particular place in time. Late 60s, early 70s, when it looks like that was the case. And then crisis theory is affected by that as well. And then under neoliberalism, there's been a sea of crises on the neoliberalism. But one thing now is that finance has been very prominent. And then people start thinking very much about finance and go to Marx, see what Marx really said about finance. Because now, the last few decades, that's been very prominent. So whenever people say that this crisis, this is the real Marx crisis theory, is very much a reflection of their own time. And if you try to zoom out, then, as I guess we should, if you try to figure out the real, like, Marx, socialist crisis theory, we can see that over time, several of these tendencies have been more or less important at different times. So, and if we're going to investigate a particular crisis, of course, one tendency can be more important than the other. But if we will try to make a general framework, which is part of the things I do in the book, we need to be open for the fact that all these tendencies can be important in different ways and on different levels of abstraction.
Right, but I mean, isn't it also a question of the temporality that you're looking at? Because some theories of crisis seek to explain, if you like, the latest crisis, the most recent crisis, whereas and therefore have a relatively short temporality. And other crisis theories, I'm thinking of certain versions of the falling rate of tendency for the rate of profit to fall, for example, are trying to look over the longue durée, if you like, over the last decades, century and a half, the evolution of profit rates and their tendential fall. So it's not just a question of crisis theories reflecting the context in which the theorists find themselves, but it's also a question of what kind of temporality they're addressing.
Yeah, that's true. But 100% true. And temporality of crisis is also complex in so many ways. But the falling rate, but still, people who defend, so especially now you have these two camps of overproduction or falling into profit. And there is a tendency with people who defend overproduction to say that the full rate of profit camp is like doomsday people who just see the whole capitalism slowly going, the profit fate is falling. But it's not at all what people like Michael Roberts says, right? For him, and for most people I've seen defending this the full rate of profit thesis, the crisis is the creative destruction that reorders the profit rate. So that would kind of fix the problem temporarily so you can start over again. And that problem wasn't fixed very hard in the 70s, 80s, but it was fixed very hard in the 40s with Second World War. So I think we can easily imagine a new world war which shake things up and in such a destructive ways that profit rate will start quite high again. It's not unthinkable, I'm sorry to say. But But another thing about crisis is that is when we're trying to think about crisis and trying to zoom out, it's a very hard topic for different reasons to study. One, we're colored by the time we live in. As I said, the zeitgeist and everything around us, just like it's hard to escape the latest trend or the trends we live in when we try to speak more generally about crisis. So any crisis theory at a certain time will reflect your time. And today, there's also a lot of economic theory or economic crisis theory hinting towards collapse today. I feel maybe increasingly. And I think that shouldn't be a surprise in we live at a time when we have this climate catastrophe in front of us. So the whole media, the whole culture is obsessed with doomsday or like for different reasons. And one is the actually very real danger of climate catastrophe. But that doesn't mean that capitalism, for example, is falling. It's two different things. Okay. So another problem with learning with crisis or dealing with crisis is to what crisis should we learn from? And I think when Marx wrote his early works, it's clear that he is learning from the 18th century. And history is...
19th century.
No, 18th century. So he's writing in the early 19th century or the 40s and 50s. Mm-hmm. And the way of looking at crisis that he bring with him in the early work is interesting enough quite related to how people view crisis in the 18th century, when crisis was more associated with revolutions. So both in the Communist Manifesto, the young Marx work, and also the letters with Engels, you see very clear like the next crisis is a massive opportunity for revolution. And then, of course, one crisis come after the other, and he is equally disappointed every time. And in the late 50s and then in the 60s, you see very clearly that his view on crisis changes. So rather than this 18th century view where crisis was associated with revolutions, I think he started to live more in his own time and see more clearly the crisis in the 19th century, which is how the economic crisis then reproduces capitalism. And this is the way you look crisis more in Capital and theories of surplus value, etc. And for us today, I think one huge problem thinking with crisis in 2020s is we're so colored by the 20th century. We live with the 20th century and we can't escape the 20th century, which is one reason. And this is, I know I'm not having the final answers here. This is more like throwing out to the listeners or everybody out there. How should we think about crisis? We're learning from the 20th century without being blinded from it. What do I mean? For example, what's very distinct about the 20th century was that the beginning and the end of Fordism had quite distinct periods, distinct times. They came with distinct crises. So in the Great Depression and then the World War was kind of the end of some kind of laissez-faire thing and beginning of Fordism. And the 73 and the 79 crisis was kind of the end of that period and the beginning of neoliberalism. It's quite easy to see when it begins and when it ends, and it comes the breaks with crisis. So I think many of us, including myself, when 2008 came, you can imagine something similar. This is the end of neoliberalism, thus the new of something else. And it will change in every aspect as it changed then. I think, and some of us has been waiting for this massive change ever since. I think this might be one reason people are talking about interregnum over and over again, because we're expecting a similar tendency as we saw in the 20th century. And maybe it comes now. Maybe something very distinct will develop in the next year. Who knows? Or maybe not. Or maybe we are too colored by the 20th century to see that the crisis have a different, or capitalism has a different form right now. And I remember getting this idea from reading David McNally's Global Slump, where he said that, interestingly enough, he wrote in the beginning of 2010s, maybe 2011, we can also see a different pattern, more similar to the 19th century. You have a crisis in the 19th century, we have a crisis every 10 years, and you just imagine that being capitalism there. But now we have this 20th century being crisis every 40, 50 years, and these strong hegemonic epochs, very distinct to each other. Are we back to some kind of 19th century temporalities? We did have a crisis in 73 in the capitalist core, 82, 91, 2000, 2008, 2020. Should we wait till 2030 for our next crisis? And of course, as Michael Roberts will tell you, there's no mutual opposition, and as not mutually exclusive, having longer waves and shorter waves, of course. But what kind of temporalities we start thinking with when thinking about the next economic crisis matters a lot. And should we start thinking with these 10-year temporalities and just accepting that this is kind of capitalism? The break was not similar to the break before and after Fordism? Or should we still go around waiting for this new massive change that will lead us into some kind of post-neoliberal, whatever that's called?
Great. So maybe you could now talk a little bit about the second aspect, the way capitalism reproduces itself through crisis. It sounds could sound a lot like the notion of Schumpeter and creative destruction. Or are you thinking of it in a different way?
No, I think creative destruction is a good place to start. So this is, Schumpeter work in different framework, but I use the same concept, and I think there's three components with creative destruction. There's the pure destructive part, where things are devalued, which of course Marxist theory emphasizes. There's the transformative part, where new things changes. New things comes up, which is more like the Schumpeterians focuses. And then, of course, at the end of this, we need investments, which is what Keynesians fetishize or loves. So I think thinking creative destruction in such a broad term, I think is a good concept to start. But if we're going to see more concretely on how, or if we're going to talk a bit more about how crises reproduce capitalism, I point to a handful of different phenomena that help explain the fact. So when I explain how capitalism produces crisis, I use some levels of abstraction. because we need to understand this on different levels of abstraction, and that's my methodology for understanding that first research question. And the second one, how crises reproduce capitalism. This is more based on an empirical observation. Okay, through time, crisis did not lead to the fall of capitalism. Opposite, the system seemed to be strengthened by crisis. How can this be the case? What must reality look like for this to be the case? And I try to use theories and then explanations to show this. And yeah, and I point to a couple of factors. I could have pointed to more. I have a proper the proper and a full understanding of this includes basically everything, and I don't do that. I do a handful of them. This partly a matter of time, partly a matter of personal limits in terms of intellectual capacity. So one is the crises themselves. Have this difference between the two crises. In economic crisis, the economy needed the crisis as a crash to reinform itself and reformulate itself and refine itself, to restore profit rates, etc. It doesn't happen with ecological crisis in the same sense. The capitalism don't need wildfires and heat waves, but they need to produce the ecological crisis in order to exist in the first place. So the shock is one thing. No, the crisis themselves is one thing. The shock is the next one. It's all crises come with a certain degree of shock. And I think Naomi Klein's shock doctrine is a brilliant book. I think her main argument there that in this situation of shock, those with economic, political, and military ideological power has the biggest chance of, using the crisis for their gains. And of course, the threat of unemployment can be just as disciplining for the working class as any military or police. The third is the relative autonomy of the state, as I already mentioned. Fourth would be nationalism. I think this comes in all kind of crises, ecological and especially economic. When there's not a crisis, we can work on discourses that we're getting global and global citizens and all that. As soon as it starts blowing, the ruling classes run to their national states, and national states save their own ruling classes by saving their own capitalist state. And nationalism comes back in as soon as there is a crisis to unite the people, rally around the flag. And then I go pretty fast through this. If somebody wants to have more on this, read a book. I do this pretty quickly, okay? So nationalism, and the fifth one is racism. When I started writing the book, I had a hypothesis that racism is quite common in crisis. When I've been working out with crisis, economic and ecological crisis for the last 200 years, racism appears in all crises. It's always there. As soon as there is a crisis, some degree of shock, you've come from the far right, the racist explanations. It always comes. Which is historically interesting, politically very important to know. Also about future crises, as soon as there will be the next crisis, the far right will be there with that racism. And it might be part of explaining the crisis, blaming people, but also part of the solution to the crisis, in terms of blame. For example, the Norwegian, the Swedish, this racist discourse can say that the Swedish and the Swede are about calm and peacefulness, and we are peaceful people, but immigrants create the chaos, and the chaos comes from elsewhere. In the middle of a big chaos, that kind of way of explaining chaos is, of course, a good currency when you're in the middle of chaos. Okay, I go quickly through this, and sixth one would be fascism. I discuss, which is just a basic argument from a lot of other authors that fascism is not for normal times, but when in the context of my book. So my hypothesis that capitalism is reproduced through crisis. When it looks like my hypothesis is failing, fascism is there to save my hypothesis, to put it blunt. And last one will be wars. And for liberals, broadly speaking, liberals always need an external understanding of crisis. They will never blame the economy itself, so they need to figure out something else that to blame to say that this is cause of the crisis. It might be political regulation, human nature, or the recent war. Marxists have traditionally turned that around and saying the causal mechanism here is not that war create crisis, it's rather than crisis create wars. And not only that, but also the crisis can be the solution to wars. The Second World War, of course, being the most, from the system perspective, the greatest creative destruction that ever could have existed. And I think this is always also politically or theoretically maybe more interesting and important when people. So that's always my final argument in discussions with people who defend some kind of collapse theory related to crisis. I don't think there is a single problem in capitalism that cannot be solved with a massive world war. That's creative destruction from the heaven, from the system perspective. But for us humans, of course, creative destruction from hell. But from a system perspective, this, is productive.
So when you maybe you want to go on from there to talk about ecological crisis, which you've already mentioned, and where your notion of ecological crisis fits in, again, the broader discussion amongst eco-Marxists and others about the nature of ecological crisis, starting perhaps with James
O'Connor.
Yeah,
so James O'Connor has this theory that economic crisis is caused by, or can be caused by, ecological crisis. And this idea that ecological concerns can bring economic concerns, that of course go through history from Ricardo to Malthus to Limits to Growth report to James O'Connor. And my argument is very much against that. When I started writing the book in 2019, my argument was 100% against it. Like, no, there's no correlation here between, it's not that kind of relation we're looking for. It's not like one crisis is causing the other. Then came, of course, a few weeks later, came Corona 2020. What was that, if not ecological crisis, the pandemic, causing a massive economic recession? So I needed to be a little bit more humble. But still, my argument, I think, is valid, that in this case, the ecological crisis then triggered the economic crisis, but it didn't cause it. So in that sense, I differ strongly from James O'Connor. And I think, and this, of course, way of thinking that ecological problems causes economic problem, you find it with Jason Moore and others as well. And you find it more recently with all kind of ideas that capitalism will go under because of the climate change. My view is simply different. Of course, you can find examples, 2020, and you can find all kind of minor examples. But the general history we have seen in capitalism so far is not that destroying nature has been a problem for capitalism, been the opposite. The general story so far in capitalism has been destroying nature has been a massive business opportunity, and it continues to be so. And then you find, for example, all kind of argument, if you're going to go there, that this is not, of course, James O'Connor's fault then, because he's not here. But the theory is about ecological destruction will at some point be a problem for the economy. And you can find arguments that ecological changes, climate changes previously has had massive problems for different rulers. Interesting and true. Big change here is that previously you have, as Marx said in the manifesto, before capitalism, the ruling class always maintained its power through maintaining status quo. Under capitalism, the ruling class maintained its power through constantly changing itself and the world around it. So in previous times, a change in climate came into a system where the rulers basically didn't want to change. Today, we have a system that basically is based on constant change. That's the fundament of the system. And that bringing change then into that system is a very different thing than bringing climate change, into a pre-capitalist system. So you find all kind of arguments as well that, for example, there's so much investment. One argument, for example, that due to the ecological crisis, this is very in line with James O'Connor, You can find argument that climate change will cost this and this much money. I saw some numbers that if climate change continues in this direction, it will devalue 17% of all like capital existing. And this is kind of the core of the James O'Connor argument, that will then lead to an economic crisis. Problem here being that, first, money disappearing from the system doesn't necessarily lead to a crisis. A crisis will include some form of devaluation and destruction, but that the devaluation in itself, that a lot of money just disappears, does not in itself lead to a crisis. It might do. Like this year, what was it, 6th of August? A massive stock exchange crash, which hardly was noticed by anybody because it didn't lead to an economic crisis. Same with this Black Monday in 1987. We hardly think about it, talk about it, because it didn't lead to an economic crisis. But a massive amount of money disappearing just from the stock exchanges. Okay. But even though if it would lead to economic crisis, still that's not a problem for capitalism, because capitalism is, one crisis after the other. That's how it reproduces itself. And the same thing with the argument that there's so much money into fixed capital, and so that will be stranded asset, that the devaluation will be so massive that it will cause economic crisis. Well, same argument. If it does, it doesn't necessarily a problem for capitalism itself. So, so one last argument for this idea about bad ecology being bad for the economy. If the world is getting warmer, I have a hard time see any other system that will be better suited for dealing with climate change. Such an organic system that capitalism is, so extremely flexible. I cannot imagine a system better suited for dealing with all that climate catastrophe that will come. Having said this, I'm aware that a lot of people will die. And so when I say what's good for a system, it's very different from good for people. I hope the viewers understand. Because also all kind of arguments that food supply will be broken and harder to grow food and stuff. Yeah, so millions of people might die. Have that historically been a problem for capitalism? No, look at colonialism, look at imperialism, look at Holocaust, genocides, nuclear bombs. That massive portions of population disappears or dies or killed has historically been just as much business opportunities as problem for a system. So, of course, at the end of the day, if there's 4 degrees and we all burn to hell, the system will disappear with us. But I don't think there's intellectually and theoretically no reason to believe that capitalism will disappear anytime soon because of climate change. And politically, I also think there's no reason for going with that argument. Rather opposite. We should work from the working hypothesis that capitalism will be with us a long time into this climate catastrophe.
So one of the chapters is about the relationship between crisis and class struggle, and maybe you'd like to talk about that interaction between crisis and class struggle.
Yeah. So writing that chapter, that's very much that was the chapter I didn't have before I started writing the book. And I started writing it, and I loved it. And at a certain point, it was over 100 pages. So should I take this out and write it as a different book? But then I shortened it down and kept it in because it's kind of an essay in itself in there. So the argument is basically that we always hear that the climate crisis is caused by someone, but the price is paid by someone else. And I think that's 100% true, and the same is true for economic crisis. They have the same class character. That the ruling class caused this crisis different ways, but the prices are paid by someone else. So I go through this. I start by going through different directions and looking at who wins a crisis, who loses a crisis, and who causes a crisis. And and I try to have this very easy conclusion, as I just mentioned. I know it's very blunt and easy. It's caused by someone, but someone else pays. But I try to go into complexity, and I try to use different theories, Marx, Weber, and stratification, to show that this fairly easy conclusion actually holds. So in terms of so who loses, I think something like stratification is needed. I think the less money you have, that simple. The less resources you have, the more dangerous are you. When it came to something like the home offices in 2020, who could be home and who needed to go to work, we need something like Weber. But to understand who creates the crisis of capitalism, we need Marx and a Marx understanding of class. And I think understanding class in this way. So a single capitalist can, of course, in terms of economy, he can do bad mistakes and a company will go under and say hundreds of workers are unemployed. And a single capitalist can do all kind of things in their local environment. But a single capitalist cannot create a crisis. A crisis can only happen in a structure where capitalists interact with each other and with workers, and that's only how economic crisis can only be caused by a class. You need a capitalist class to create this kind of crisis. So in the same way that single capitalists can build a house or a street or even a city, but only as a class can the capitalist class create a world in its image. Similarly, with the economic crisis, a single capitalist can, of course, pollute a river, destroy nature for a lot of people living in a certain area or even a region. But something like climate change it's only possible because they act as a class. They do certain forms of investment, they do certain form of things together, in production, in trade, in circulation, etc. That they do as a class activity, and that's only how they together can create something like climate change. Yeah. So that's some of the arguments, and there's also arguments about little bit hinting towards discussions of strategy. I will open that discussion a little bit there, and in recent discussions on the left has been very polarized between degrowthers and eco-modernists. I think this is a very poor polarization for a handful of reasons. The discussions of growth, for example, is completely messed up with this polarization. But also applications for class. I think both sides are part of the problem. On the eco-modernist side, you find people arguing that the so-called environmentalist movement is composed of the so-called middle class or professional managerial class or whatever you're going to call them, and these are somehow part of the problem. And I think that view is deeply problematic analytically, because a lot of these people are, in my view, working class, but a different section of the working class than other parts, the lower parts of the working class, maybe. But extremely problematic politically, because what we need to do in this historical time is to unite the environmentalist movement and the working labor movement. And one way of doing that is saying basically that this is the same class, but two different parts of the same class, and this must be united. Okay, because these people in the environmentalist movement, even though they might have a piano at home or wherever, I don't think any of them owns means of production or invests in any meaningful sense to destroy the earth. And their enemy is, and they are quite good in this sense, are the big companies. So they are basically part of the working class, pointing their rage against part of the ruling class, the capitalist class, and that is for me a class struggle, even though they themselves hasn't articulated. But the degrowthers also kind of plays into this in a negative sense often, not always. There are good people on both sides doing relatively good things, and maybe I'm drawing this polarization too far, but there are also arguments on this degrowth pole which makes it harder. And this is when the working class is the problem. And Tajir Muller says the workers in I'm not sure if he said the coal mines or some of the working fossil industries are not only our enemies, but our worst efficient enemies. And that is also a way of alienating the labor movement. So where the eco-modernists are alienating the environmentalist movement, the degrowthers are alienating the labor movement at exact the time where we need both, and we need to unite and strengthen both. So I'm trying to take some kind of class analysis which goes a little bit a different direction than that kind of polarization.
So you mentioned the far right, of course, and we're speaking in the shadow of the massive victory of Trump in the American elections. And I think it's fair to say that if we look at the history of crises, the far right benefit from crises as much, if not more, than the far left. What do you think that the conjunction or interaction between economic and ecological crises will change in terms of the nature and danger of the far right in the present?
Yeah, that is a very good question. So what we have seen so far is that large part of the far left going into Keynesianism because alternative is now far right often. So as the crisis comes with a certain degree of shock, and as crisis comes with a certain lack of time, we're in a hurry, and it comes with a seriousness. This is important. I think it's very important. Very often, that the far left kind of says that okay, then we leave our dreams about revolution and just okay, we go with say Biden because alternative is Trump. I think I call this the Keynesian fishing net. How the left is always trapped in with Keynes because suddenly it becomes important, and then we don't dare to stand up in our own belief, our own our own strategies anymore because the alternative is always the far right, and this has been the case for the last years, definitely, both economic and ecological crisis. What happened now with the center imploding? Is it what happened if there is no Kamala Harris in between anymore? If there's a huge legitimation crisis in the social liberal or the liberal spheres, what happened then? Is that something that the far left should try to gain from? Hopefully. But I know if we don't have a proper crisis theory or crisis policy before the crisis hit, we have a problem. And I think that's maybe one of the political implications for my book. I think we need to start thinking about crisis before it hits. And that means now, basically. So when the crisis hits, it's too late to start to come up with these great ideas about what to do. Then you adapt. Then you try to maneuver. You go for what ideas you already have. And you that's where you end up because you're maneuvering in a very narrow sense. So if we're going to do something more radical in the crisis, we need to know a little bit from beforehand what to do. This is hard in different ways. It's hard because we don't know what the next crisis will look like, for example. So we need to prepare for something we don't know what it is. And we need to do this on different levels, again, on abstractions, or different levels of generality. We need a crisis critique. We need to understand the crisis, where they come from, what they do, and how they benefit the ruling class and the far right rather than us. We need crisis policies. And these are more kind of the ideas about what to do in a more general sense, which we kind of know exactly what is, but need to be prepared. And we also need crisis management, because we need to know exactly how to deal with this and this problem when the crisis hit. And this is often very maybe ignored in more left radical milieus, because this is more a sphere of politics. But extremely important. Politically, the crisis as the event that hit and hurt people must be handled there and then. And we must have an idea about what to do, exactly what to do before the crisis comes. So this might sound very difficult to work on different levels, and as socialists, we're not there yet. We need to develop more thinking and more policy around this. But looking at, for example, at Keynesians and neoliberals before 2020 at least, they had this. So when there's a crisis, the Keynesians know exactly what to do. Now, invest. It's just there. It comes automatically. It's there reflex. And it's related to underlying views on the economy. And the neoliberals especially before 2020 or 2024, it was the same thing. The crisis hit, deregulate, privatize some shit. And it relates to underlying views, theories of how the economy works. So they managed somehow to get these different levels of abstraction together. And similarly must we, socialists, more eco-socialists, have a plan when the crisis comes. okay, crisis comes, then we know exactly what to do. Now, I don't know exactly what that would be, but more like, so, okay, nationalize, demand this, or creative destruction with this program where we destroy that fossil sector or whatever. Having those kind of ideas before the crisis hit, and then adapting them to the actual crisis, and then implementing. But this is work that must be done, beforehand. Either I'm afraid it will be too late.
Does this connect to the notion that has been popularized by, for example, Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France with the La France Insoumise of ecological planning as a kind of transitional program, if you like, that points towards a post-capitalist future?
I don't know, but I don't know the French context that well. But I saw after the last election that it did have, and that was after I finished writing my book, so I didn't steal it. But I see that they did have demands on different levels. That they did have immediate demands, mid-scale demands, and long-term demands, which I thought was very interesting to see, because that was actually exactly what I have written just before, which I think is very good. Exactly what I mean by this ecological planning, I'm not sure. I don't know the context that well.
Well, we'll be publishing a book by Cédric Durand and Razmik Kocheyan, I hope next year or the year after, which is about the notion of ecological planning.
Mm-hmm.
And no doubt we can debate it at greater length this weekend at the HM conference. So you end the book with what you call 10 thoughts on socialist crisis policy. Maybe you'd like to run through those quickly.
Yeah, so I've been mentioning some already. The first one be, and they are not all really thoughts on crisis policy, but some of them are. And the first one being, we need to prepare something in advance, which I just mentioned. Some kind of, transitional program, or some kind of knowing what to do when it hits, before it hits. That kind of thinking is very important. The second one is class. All crises come with a class character. They always try to hide this between under nationalism or behind racism or something, but it's always there. And socialists must be there and to open this and make it openly into a matter of class struggle. I mentioned racism. It's always coming. Be prepared for it. Know that it's coming. Know how to handle it. We don't know how it's coming. We don't even know who they will blame. Today, most likely Muslims, because it's a hype. Well, that's the recent extreme racism going in that direction. But we don't really know exactly where it's going, but it's coming. And I have thoughts on this working within and without the state, or within and beyond the state. Those kind of ideas is there, and I have discussions on open discussions on social reproduction there. Life against capital, which became a famous, good slogan under corona pandemic, etc. And a few other those kind of discussions. And
I think you need to develop those a bit more.
Yeah, but I don't remember exactly what they are, last of them. But
socialism must confront growth, but cannot start by stopping it.
Yeah, thank you. And that also speaks to what I mentioned earlier between the discussion between degrowth and eco-modernists, which is partly problematic because of class, but maybe equally problematic because of growth. And growth is a hard issue. It's a problematic issue. Growth is, of course, a part of the problem, as it is part of capitalism, as it is part of climate change, obviously. So we need to stop growth somehow in order to stop, climate disaster in the long term. But having a political project that starts with confronting growth, as degrowthers can deny this is the case with degrowth, but it's in the name, it's in the manifesto of degrowth that the growth is the problem. I think it's equally problematic if you want to, have a broader base in the broad working class. I think it's a useless place to start, and also, of course, obviously, and even degrowthers will accept this argument, but we need all kind of investments that will lead to more growth if growth is understood as increasing GDP. I'm not going into all this debate about what growth might mean in this enormous debate, but in terms of GDP, that will increase if we have a massive investment in railways, for example. So my position there would be something like you said, the headline of the subchapter. We need to confront growth, but we cannot start by making a campaign against growth as way of confronting it.
Within and beyond the system, eco-socialist policy as non-reformist reforms.
Yeah, that being the one I just mentioned as well with the... and I think this is general true that socialists should work within and beyond the system. And I think it's more important than ever with climate change. And we cannot just work outside the system, and we cannot only work inside the system for a handful of reasons. And with climate change, it's just absolutely crucial once again. Yeah.
Eco-socialism turns capitalist geography upside down.
Yeah. And thank you for reminding me, by the way, about these subchapters. So here's my argument that there is also some human geographer. So we haven't talked about this much about geography so far in this session. And I don't speak that much explicitly about geography in the book, but it's I think it's there. So I have argument that the crisis, the economic and ecological, has gone from more local to global phenomena, which is a complex argument for a handful of reasons. But the complexity you can find in the book, that's my general argument. So the crisis has become global, both economic and ecological, but the response to the crisis are national. And we need to turn that upside down so that the economy become more local, but thinking about it becoming more global. And the responding about it and the policy about it maybe becoming a bit more global in different ways. When I say that the economy becoming more local, I don't say it as a conclusion. I say more as a hypothesis and a way of thinking about it. I don't think that should be... I'm not an anarchist in the sense that I think local is better per se. There should be an aim to become more local like in itself. But I think it will be a consequence if we start doing ecological planning. If we start taking seriously, okay, planning and how much can we produce, where we're going to produce it, how much can we consume, etc., in an organized, planned manner, which benefits workers and within certain ecological limits, I think the conclusion necessarily will be that economy will become more local. So that's my way of saying it will become more local rather than
certain aspects, perhaps.
Than I wanted.
Certain aspects would become more local. Some aspects of food production, for example, but perhaps not. To frame it in terms of the economy would become more local does seem to point towards a kind of neo-Proudhonist kind of imaginary.
Yeah, no, but and I try not to go there, but I think as a consequence, I think so much of the production, as you say, not necessarily everything, but so much of production will be more local and less transport, etc., which make it more local. Having said that, something might become more national as well. Some production you don't need maybe in every country. If you can have more planned on a higher level, higher geographical scales than that, etc. So I'm not saying that's everything pointing in that direction, but so many different things are pointing in that direction that I think is fair to say. But without becoming any kind of, anarchist in a sense.